I remember as a kid at some point during autumn, we were hollowing out and cutting these kind of faces in beads actually. And this is a practice that probably rests on ritual logic that I think is very fundamental to Nordic Animism. There's this thing about transformation of what I've called essences. People seem to have this will that they want to condense essences of nature, of a holiday, of a season, of the wilderness, of the crops. And then they want to transform these essences in ways that seem to dialogue with or mirror sort of life-giving transformations, like corn to bread, for instance. So you build a corn doll, a deity out of the crop, then you make beer out of it, and then you give the beer to the earth or to the wild hunt or something like that. And these faces that I remember making as a kid, some sort of that kind of logic. And it's very dense. In fact, it's so dense that I'm not really sure I fully understand it. It's a combination of the threshold into the dark time, monstrosity inside a life-giving produce, death and life sort of brought together at the threshold between the light and the dark period of the year. Dangerous monstrosity sort of inside life upholding sustenance. So when you have, for instance, light shining inside a bead, then it's something that belongs underground. It's almost like turning on the light in the underworld, or turning on a monster in the underworld, or something like that. These here, they're just contemporary pumpkins, because the Nordic All Hallows or All Souls November Day traditions, they've been waning quite a lot, to the point of almost disappearing. In my childhood, I barely remember All Hallows being marked at all. But then Danish culture went and did what all living healthy culture does. It imports. Often stuff that seems other, but is really very closely aligned to pre-existing cultural notions or ideas. So Danes did that. They did what natural humans do, and they're not impeded by nationalist exclusionisms. They went and borrowed culture perceived as other. And then we got Halloween. At the same time, new and sort of newly imported, and a bit other in this context, yet symbolisms that work over exactly the same or similar themes as have been there probably since the Vikings celebrated the Veternatur, or the winter nights, at around this time of year. It's even called Halloween, even though we do have a name for All Hallows in our own language. My little daughter, she calls it Halloween. And it's an import from a place in the world where exactly this holiday has become this wonderfully rich and powerful expression in North America. So when Danes are now growing pumpkins, not so much actually to make pumpkin pies or soups, but mostly as adornments actually for this holiday, which is still sort of perceived as a new thing, but to my children, it'll be the way it always was. And that's also a really interesting thing about how rituals work. They can be very recent, yet give us a sense of being somehow internal, as it's like it was always like that, you know. That is as if there's something about rituals that is beyond time somehow. And it's also somehow true. This American Halloween, even though it's a really new thing, it also represents these sort of native motifs that might have been here already. And in that sense, it's, you know, a very constant, maybe not beyond time in that sense. And the fact that it's from North America directly basically just spices it up a little bit with the otherness. And this looking for the other is in fact a very fundamental part of how I think any culture work. The American phenomenologist Thomas Saunders considered this strive towards alterity or otherness to be a driving motor in religiosity, almost an inherent thing pointing towards other. And you find this in many human situations. Europeans, for instance, have always had this thing about the East as other and as religiously powerful, this ancient tradition, you know. Christianity came to Europe and linked with this, it was kind of this sort of new Eastern religious movement, that appealed by being exotic and deep and oriental. And you find it in many different contexts. For instance, in Viking Age Scandinavia, there was even a practice called finfaring, Gjera finfara, or fara att finnar spörja spa, meaning visiting the Sami, who were perceived as an important cultural other in order to acquire religious knowledge. Norwegian kings also emphasized in the sagas were written down that they were really had partly of Sami descent. This was a way of claiming some otherness that would, a way of saying I'm a powerful, legitimate king. And this might even have played a role in Snorri Sturluson's casting of the Asia gods as Asians, an idea that gods came from far away, they're other. It might have been a literary theme in Snorri's hands, but this fundamental idea of otherness might well reflect both medieval and possibly also pre-Christian valorizations of otherness as powerful. We mostly tend to envision the Middle Ages as these super white spaces, but it's just a fact that the same people who invented and enjoyed and developed the tales of King Arthur, these noble casts of knights at their courts and so on, that they had as their patron deity for medieval knighthood, Saint Mauritius, a black man. The actual medieval knights worshipped a black man as their most quintessential image of what knighthood meant to them, right? And this is just a historic fact. And that wasn't because they practiced what we would call inclusivity or had ideals that would work inside the Black Lives Matter movement. Medieval warrior culture wasn't progressive in our sense, of course. They were probably wildly chauvinist people in some senses who would exert random violence, for instance, towards people that they considered inferior, commoners or slaves or something like that. But it just shows us that they didn't think about race in that way. When they looked at Saint Mauritius, the black saint of knighthood, they saw otherness, and that was valorized, charged, powerful. And there's something about All Souls or All Hallows Day being associated with the dead that links with this, because death in itself is a very strong perspective on other. Being dead is one of the most basic, fundamental way of being other, you might say. The dead is, very other. and lately, this particular holiday is actually also starting being infused with another American holiday here, and that is Dia de los Muertos, which Danes interestingly name in their own language, calling Day of the Dead, a little bit like, we already knew that. And this is obviously very close to the original meanings, and this expression just seems new here. And it's adding new layers of meaning to it, and people are inventing or re-engaging this ancient animist holiday, which represents the threshold between the time of life, the summer, and the time of death and darkness, the winter, right? So where Halloween has gotten a touch of vulgar capitalism and children's merchandise to it, I think it lost a little bit of the poetry and richness and beauty, I think, of real North American Halloween. Europeans sometimes tend to have a little bit of chauvinist perspective on North American culture, as if it's a little bit inferior or inauthentic. So when North Americans, have kept alive and transmitted and developed this amazing holiday, then Europeans sometimes put it down a little bit. It was a little bit of a dismissive rejection of North American culture as its own authentic Euro-descendant and Euro-Creole, of course, culture. But paradoxically, then the Day of the Dead, which is also an American thing, just Mexican, seems to be perceived a little bit more classy somehow. There's like churches and cultural associations that have lectures considering life and death and these kind of things. So, and Dia de los Muertos has, of course, its own interesting history. There was Southern European All Souls celebrations dating back to the Roman Paternalia, forefather celebrations that got absorbed in the Catholic commemorations of the faithful departed. And this went into natural exchange and synergy with local American indigenous traditions somewhat early in the year, I think, Aztec celebrations around August and stuff like that. And this developed into this almost like a cult of the dead taking place around this time of year. And in specific indigenous Mexican communities who developed like these rituals of spectacular beauty where specific butterflies migrating identified with the souls of the dead, like streaming through the world and so on. And these local celebrations belonging to specific communities was then appropriated or adopted by Mexican nationalism and made into symbolic of Mexican state adherence and statehood, and then they became a nationwide thing. So instead of being these very local indigenous Mexicans honoring their dead, it became a way that Mexicans portrayed their Mexican-ness. So in northern Mexico, for instance, this only started to be celebrated sometime in the 20th century. And I think it is today even showing signs of becoming a pan-Hispanic thing, and even moving even further. Today, I think this remarkable combination of Gothic and fairy, gore and beauty is truly transatlantic parade of Native American ancestrality and European dance macabre tradition seems to be going global a little bit and merging with other All Souls celebrations like Halloween, a bit like perhaps the South German Krampus, which is a similarly incredibly beautiful, ancient, yet very dynamically contemporary tradition that's spreading all over the world. It's as if people are today drawn towards these traditional culture with the potential for re-enchantment and re-engaging animist realities. I've myself been an anchor person in trying to reintroduce the Nordic Yule goat here in Copenhagen with inspiration from the Krampuslauf that's globalizing at the moment. And Krampus comes from white people, so it has less problems spreading, because for unfathomable reasons, people who claim to be anti-racists paradoxically suddenly have a huge problem when non-white or people of more racially ambiguous observance like Mexicans, when their culture is being exported all over the place and receiving universal appreciation. But yes, future will tell if the natural spread of also the Day of the Dead into our All Hallows, All Souls celebrations in Northern Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, if it will be allowed to happen and it will receive the valorization that it really deserves as this uniquely beautiful and powerful contribution to humanity that it really is, or if it will be blocked by these ultranationalist value systems that are sometimes practiced by people who identify leftist. Anyway, that was a couple of thoughts on the All Souls Day celebration in super interesting, ongoing flux and reinvention. And I should mention that also the Rune Animist War Calendar, with its explanatory book, the Rune Animist Year, that you can find you can find specific kind of other culture also related to this holiday, and that is traditional Nordic culture, how people used to sacrifice a hell horse on the All Hallows and how they used to gather offerings of fodder and bring it to a sacred boar in the village and this kind of stuff. Yep. Let me just end this video by describing a little bit what I do a little bit more. My name is Rune Hjarnø Rasmussen. I'm a PhD in history of religions. I'm working at seeing Nordic history of religions as processes of rejecting animist knowledge, and this is a strictly academic side of my work, and I think I'll make a video soon that explains a little bit more exactly about the academic side of it. But I'm not only working with academia, I'm also trying to work these perspectives into play in contemporary culture and society, sometimes in playful and experimental ways of doing like cultural activism and so on. I believe that scholarship should be used to play back into culture, and I'm doing this in a number of different ways. One is that, as I mentioned, I'm an anchor person in the contemporary cultural event trying to re-engage Nordic Animism around Yuletide, and another thing is that I've been producing debate together with a group of scholars in public media, where we're trying to introduce traditional knowledge not as this nostalgic thing of the past, but as a living contemporary mode of environmentalist reflection about how we may behave a little bit less apocalyptically, cataclysmically destructive towards the world that we live in. The fundamental meaning, I think, of what people used to call fertility religion, engaging the world in respectful and kind ways so that the world gives us respect and kindness back in the form of giving humans sustainably life-supporting spaces to live in. Yes, I've also been creating popularization, as mentioned, in the form of a calendar that tries to communicate outside, the worst academic hula-bula language, and introducing lay people to a traditional knowledge perspective on their own daily lives. I'm also doing it in other ways, projects that will hopefully be launched in not so long. So if you like what I'm doing, then there are actually a number of ways that you can support me. And I do need the support. From a professional employment perspective, this is a fringe thing I'm doing. I'm an unemployed father of 3, and I'm trying to make ends meet while trying to change the world through this particular perspective. So it's possible to Patreon support me, but that's not the only thing you can do. You can also share my work. You can share it into groups. You can ping your friends. You can like it. You can follow it. If you're on YouTube, you can press the little like buttons and the little subscribe buttons and write a little message saying, "Cool shit, Rune. What does this or that mean?" and so on. And social media activity is in relation to my work that supports my channel. So thanks a lot for listening, and see you around.